Warm welcome to the 2015 Rosalind Wilson Memorial Lecture. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, we are very fortunate in having Chandra Guha to deliver the 23rd Rosalind Wilson Memorial Lecture. Chandra Guha is undoubtedly one of the finest historians and thinkers of the present generation. He has taught at the Universities of Yale and Stanford and has been the Indo-American Community Visiting Professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Chandra Guha has authored many books, which include a pioneering environmental history, The Unquiet Woods, and an award-winning social history of cricket. His most recent book, Gandhi Before India, was chosen as a notable book of the year by the New York Times. Apart from his books, Guha also writes a syndicated column that appears in 6 languages. Guha has received many awards. I'll mention only a few, which inter alia include the Ramnath Goenka Prize for Excellence in Journalism, the Sahitya Academy Award, and the R.K. Narayan Prize. In 2014, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in the humanities by Yale University. Now, without further ado, may I request Chandra Guha to enlighten us on the interesting subject he has chosen for his lecture, namely, between nationalism and internationalism, the political philosophy of Rabindranath Tagore. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Soli. Thank you all. It's a great privilege and honor to speak in memory of Rosalind Wilson. I had a brief acquaintance with her. I got to know her shortly before she died, and I could sense even in 2 or 3 meetings that she was an exceptional person. Now, why have I chosen to speak on Tagore? There's several reasons for this. One, the obvious one is that Soli's mentioned, Ross was an internationalist, Tagore was an internationalist. Ross was an educationist, Tagore was an educationist. But it's also to do with a kind of personal project of mine, which I have been pursuing for the last few years, and I hope to pursue for another few years, which is to rescue Tagore from the parochial embrace of the Bengalis. This is one of several such attempts that should be made by many other scholars on behalf of many other people. Jawaharlal Nehru needs to be rescued from the protective embrace of the Congress Party. Baba Sahib Ambedkar was much more than a Dalit icon. So, we have a tendency to parochialize our heroes, and Tagore has been particularly subject to this. Beyond his plays, his poems, and his songs and his novels. So this lecture is based on the non-fiction writings of Tagore. To appreciate his poetry and his songs, probably you need to be Bengali. To fully appreciate his poetry and his songs, you probably need to be Bengali. But beyond his creative output, he was a deeply insightful and precocious thinker on questions of nationalism and internationalism. And in my talk, I'm going to trace some elements in his thinking on nationalism and internationalism. I'm going to take some selective, some highlights, some particular episodes in the history of the 20th century that provoked or inspired his most insightful remarks on politics. It's not going to be a comprehensive talk. There needs to be a book written on this subject. On Tagore, the political thinker, there needs to be a book written, preferably by a non-Bengali, and even more preferably by a non-Indian, I suspect. But one I will defend is, I said some months ago, maybe more than some months ago, I said the 4 greatest Indians of the 20th century were Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, and Tagore. Now, unlike Gandhi, Nehru, and Tagore, Tagore was most consciously internationalist, and he traveled much more widely than the other 3. The other 3, Gandhi, Nehru, and Tagore, left India for instrumental reasons. To study, in one case Harrow and Cambridge, in another case Columbia and the London School of Economics, in a third case to qualify as a barrister in London. Gandhi then went to South Africa to practice his trade after failing twice in the Bombay High Court. In fact, Soli must have started his career in the Bombay High Court. And if Gandhi had succeeded like Soli, the world would have been a different place. But he failed in the Bombay High Court and went to South Africa. Nehru traveled extensively in the 1930s as an international socialist. He traveled even more in the 1940s and 50s as Prime Minister of India. But Tagore's travels were purely out of curiosity. And it's quite extraordinary the range of countries he visited. He went to Japan 4 times. I'll say a little bit about his travels to Japan. He went, of course, to many countries in Europe. He went to the United States. He even went to Java, to Southeast Asia, Iran, at the age of 70. At a time when travel was incredibly difficult, he went to Iran because he knew that Iran had, of course, very important cultural, intellectual, literary, musical connections with India. So he was a restless traveler who traveled to other lands out of curiosity, not to get degrees or not to represent his country, but simply to see and speak with humans of a cultural or religious or national background different from his own. Part of this curiosity came from his family background, because his family was also very well traveled. And from very early on, he was between East and West. He goes to England as a young man, spends a few months in a school. He didn't even have a high school degree, by the way, let alone, yet he created a magnificent university, which is a lesson to some people who have many degrees and try to create universities. But here was this man. He didn't even have a high school degree. He spent a few months in London as a high school student. And then shortly afterwards, when he's just turned 20, he writes to a friend. This is in his early 20s. He writes to a friend, "I sometimes detect in myself a background where 2 opposing forces are constantly in action. One beckoning me to peace and cessation of strife, the other engaging me to battle." I think it's something many writers still face today. Do you concentrate on your research, on your writing, in your creative output, or do you engage with society? Then he goes on. It is though, he's interpreting this dialectic, this conflict within him, he's saying, it is as though the restless energy and the will to action of the West were perpetually assaulting the citadel of my Indian placidity. Hence the swing of the pendulum between passionate pain and calm detachment, between lyrical abandon and philosophizing, between love of my country and mockery of patriotism, between an itch to enter the lists and a longing to remain wrapped in thought. Now, it's a precocious passage in the early 1880s, when he's in his early 20s, and it captures Tagore's lifelong mission, which is to synthesize East and West, a mission that was partly personal, partly civilizational, and eventually also partly political. And I'm going to talk about the political aspect of the encounter between East and West as seen through the eyes of Tagore. You could talk about this encounter in aesthetic terms, in musical terms, in literary terms, in personal terms, but I'm going to talk about it in political terms. And there are a few landmark political events I'm going to talk about, which are going to figure as kind of markers on Tagore's journey through his life. There's just 3 or 4. I could take more. The first is the Swadeshi movement of 1905-1907, about which he wrote a famous novel, Gahare Baire, and made into also a classic film by Satyajit Ray. And many of you would have seen that novel, or read that novel, or seen that film. So the Swadeshi movement of 1905-1907, which was particularly active in Bengal, was one political moment in the 20th century that affected Tagore radically. The second event that affected him radically was the onset of the First World War. And the third event was Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. The fourth event would be the Second World War, by which time he was dying, and I'm not going to really get into this. But these 3 great events of the 20th century, 2 peculiar to India and 1 global in its scope. The Swadeshi movement, the First World War, and Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation movement are kind of the background to the evolution of Tagore's thought and the passages from his works that I'm going to cite. Now, Tagore was ambivalent about the Swadeshi movement. In a letter written to a friend in November 1908, he wrote, patriotism cannot be our final spiritual shelter. I mean, the Swadeshi movement for the young people in this audience, let's refresh ourselves, was a patriotic movement that tended into xenophobia. The burning of foreign cloth, could so easily be identified with hatred of the British, hatred of the foreigner, hatred of anything outside India. So he says, patriotism cannot be our final spiritual shelter. I will not buy glass for the price of diamonds, and I will never allow patriotism to triumph over humanity as long as I live. I will never allow patriotism to triumph over humanity as long as I live. And then he continues in this private letter, I took a few steps down that road, the patriotic road, and stopped. For when I cannot retain my faith in universal man standing over and above my country, when patriotic prejudices overshadow my spirit, I feel inwardly starved. The Swadeshi movement provoked Tagore to write a brilliant essay, long, sort of almost book-length essay, called East and West in Greater India, which was published in the Bengali journal Pravasi in the latter months of 1908. And this text was based on lectures delivered by Tagore at different venues in Bengal, and I'm using obviously the English translation, which was done by one of his nephews. This essay of 1908 criticizes the sectarianism and xenophobia that lay at the heart of nationalist politics. Tagore writes in extraordinarily moving, whether India is to be yours or mine, whether it belongs more to the Hindu or the Muslim, or whether some other race, not Hindu nor Muslim, but some other race, is to assert a greater supremacy than either, that is not the problem with which providence is exercised. It is not as if at the bar at the judgment seat of the Almighty, different advocates are engaged in pleading the rival causes of Hindu, Muslim, and Westerner, and the party that wins the decree shall finally plant the standard of permanent possession. So it's not as if Hindu, Muslim, and Westerner, these are almighty and you're saying, and the guy who wins will plant the flag of permanent possession. And he continues, it is only our vanity which makes us think that this is a battle between contending rights. The only real battle is the eternal one between truth and untruth. So after this powerful plea against ideological or sectarian or national arrogance, he turns to India's relationship with the West. And he says, in 1908, if India had been deprived of touch with the West, she would have lacked an element essential for her attainment of perfection. Europe now has her lamp ablaze. Europe now has her lamp ablaze. He's talking about the early 20th century. We must light our torches at its wick and make a fresh start on the highway of time. That our forefathers 3,000 years ago had finished extracting all that was of value from the universe is not a worthy thought. We are not so unfortunate, nor is the universe so poor. Now, there are some Tagore scholars in this audience, and there's a line that has stuck in my mind from many years of reading Tagore, but I can't find that line, and maybe I made it up, but I made it up, I hope, in the spirit of Tagore. But I'm sure maybe there's somewhere in Tagore, and I think Tagore says somewhere that we must glory in the illumination of a lamp lit anywhere in the world. As I said, I can see a Tagore scholar in the front row, I can see a Tagore scholar standing there behind, and I hope they can find the correct citation. And even if it's not, should be true. It sounds like Tagore. It sounds like Tagore, that we should glory in the illumination of a lamp lit anywhere in the world. Now, this essay of 1908 that I quoted from, published in the journal Pravasi, it has an interesting publishing history, which if I have time, I'll come to later, is a precursor, a forgotten precursor to a much better known book of Tagore, which is his great little book, Nationalism, which several among you would have read in the audience. Nationalism is more or less the first serious publication of Tagore in English. There is another essay a few years earlier called Sadhana, which is on education. But nationalism, which was published in 1916, 2 years the first, or to exterminate them. It is always watchful to keep at bay the aliens or to exterminate them. It is carnivorous and cannibalistic in its tendencies. It feeds upon the resources of other peoples and tries to swallow their future. It is always afraid of other races achieving eminence and tries to thwart all symptoms of greatness outside its boundaries. Now, speaking to a Japanese audience, Tagore says that the choices before us in Asia, in Japan, in India, in Indonesia, in China and Vietnam, the choices that were presented to us in 1916 and possibly even in 2015 are between fear and flattery, between lying passively dormant or imitating the West. Of course, there's a third one, which is totally rejecting the West, which also Tagore doesn't appreciate. Japan, says Tagore, can show a third way, embrace the best of the West without damage to her cultural traditions. True modernism, the poet told his Japanese audience, is freedom of mind, not slavery of taste. It is independence of thought and action, not tutelage under European schoolmasters. So from Japan, then Tagore crosses the Pacific Ocean and goes to the United States. He reaches the Pacific port city of Seattle in the last week of September 1916. He stays 4 months in North America, crisscrossing the continent, addressing audiences large and small on the perils of nationalism. There's a wonderful book on Tagore's trips to America by the late literary historian Sujit Mukherjee. It's called Passage to America, and it's based on deep private research, which describes the kind of very mixed reception his speeches got all across the United States. Like Japan, the US had not entered the First World War. Like Japan, therefore, Tagore thought it was free to make its destiny other than in the image of Europe. So Tagore tells his audience, now when this cruel war has driven its claws into the vitals of Europe, her hoard of wealth has burst into smoke, and her humanity is shattered into bits by her battlefield. This has led to an escalating cycle of conflict where machine must be pitted against machine, nation against nation, in an endless bullfight of politics. So he described what is happening in Europe, and then he's telling the Americans, like he told the Japanese, you can show a different way. Perhaps, thought Tagore, this newest of Western nations, the United States, could show a different way. The experimentalism that he saw as a sign of America's youth. Unlike the Europeans, thought Tagore, and remember this is 1916, unlike the Europeans, Tagore thought the Americans were not intrinsically colonialist. Their history had been disinterested, and that's why they were able to help Japan in her lessons in Western civilization. America is destined to justify Western civilization to the East. The poet told his host, hopefully, you are carrying all the responsibility of a great future because you are untrammeled by the grasping miserliness of a past. So these warnings that he was addressing to the Japanese and the Americans was to not to succumb to the cult of the nation or the cult of the machine, and still less to the cult of the gun or the tank, and not to be cannibalistic and carnivorous in coveting the resources of other countries, and to show a different way of reconciling civilization and modernity, a different way of pursuing the path of justice and reason in a non-destructive fashion. And at this stage, Japan was the largest Asian country not to be colonized, the first Asian country to have a sophisticated industry, and of course a country which had an extraordinarily rich civilization, tradition of art, music, aesthetics, philosophy, and so on. And America was new, not burdened by the past, making itself a country that had escaped the class structure of feudal Europe, as Tocqueville famously pointed out. So he was very hopeful about these countries. Now, however, Tagore's lectures and warnings were received very badly in both Japan and the United States. Both of whom, both Japan and the United States, wanted to claim and conquer the world. They wanted to replace Germany and Britain as the world's great superpowers. And in Sujit Mukherjee's book, there are some wonderful quotes about how disgusted the American audiences were. And there's a lovely quote, I think it's from the Minneapolis Tribune, quoted by Sudip Mukherjee. He said, here is this Oriental sage who has come in a flowing robes to scold us, and he scolds us at $700 a scold. So that was the fee that his lecture agent had got for him. So that's the first the second major moment in sort of Tagore's political trajectory. I've talked about the Swadeshi movement. I've talked about the First World War and his reactions and the highly ambiguous response that his audiences in Europe and his audiences in America and Japan gave him. And I now turn to the third, and in some ways, at least for all Indians, the most intriguing and important aspect, Tagore's relations with Gandhi, as sparked by the non-cooperation movement. Now, I did tell you that my understanding of Tagore was changed by a book I read called Truth Called Them Differently, edited by R.K. Prabhu, published by the Navjeevan Press in 1959. There's now a much better version of that book. It's called The Mahatma and the Poet. It's edited by the very distinguished historian Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. And it's got more or less the complete Tagore-Gandhi correspondence. I mean, it's a book, if you were to ask me, I mean, I've already told you about my reckless generalizations. If you would tell me which is one book every Indian should read, it would be The Mahatma and the Poet, which is the exchanges between Tagore and Gandhi, skillfully introduced and set in context by the historian Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. Because it really is. I mean, it's an encounter of, profoundly important significance and magnitude between two truly great world figures. As I was talking earlier on before I came here, which I often do, I went and saw one more generalization, if I may offer. The person I consider the wisest man in India, Professor Andre Bete, who lives a relatively reclusive life, and I was telling him this, and he was saying, yes, he was saying, Nehru and Ambedkar were shaped by circumstance, and they became great. But Tagore and Gandhi were sui generis.